Thanks very much. As you know, John Heathershaw's not here today, so I'm doing the honours in terms of presenting our project. I have to admit, I have never seen these slides before, so this will be a good test of whether we are conceptually on the same page inside our project. What we're looking at is, as the title says, rising powers and conflict management in Central Asia. Excuse me. And we're trying to look at rising powers in the light, of course, of much broader global conversation about the increasing confrontation over international regimes of peace and security. So the increasing divergence among major powers over internal conflicts in particular, in Libya, Syria, now Ukraine, of course, these very different understandings of what conflict is and the appropriate and most effective responses to it. And we've taken that sort of global discussion, that global conversation, and tried to use a microcosm of the international system as a way of trying to understand these different conceptions of conflict and different approaches to managing conflict. And we're looking at Central Asia, which is a particularly interesting part of the world in relation to these so-called rising powers, of course. We're mostly focusing on Russia and China. We have also an interest in the role of Turkey. India is increasingly influential in the region as well, although all these states remain somewhat marginal to this real geopolitical struggle in the region. And of course, we are also examining both American and European policy in the region. So it's the interaction between these three or perhaps four different approaches to conflict in the region that is of particular interest to us. And of course, this raises this interesting question about whether these really are rising powers. These are the great historical powers in the region, China and Russia. And in many ways, it's the United States, of course, which is the newcomer, the rising power in Central Asia, if you like. But our sense of it is what we're interested in is this resistance, if you like, emerging from these powers in the region to a dominant paradigm of liberal approaches to conflict management. So in a way, this is about a particular sort of normative understanding of conflict, a particular understanding of what is the appropriate response to conflict, issues such as the role of the state and the role of international actors in managing conflict. And one of the questions really is, why is conflict somewhat limited in Central Asia? Although there's a perception that this is a very unruly region racked by conflict, in reality there have been a range of rather limited armed conflicts over the last decade. And we want to understand in what ways those conflicts actually have been managed and been limited, both by local action and local political responses, and by the actions and responses of major powers in the region. And those major powers, of course, are not just acting bilaterally, but in the case of Central Asia, we have these competing security and economic blocs. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, largely inspired by China. We have the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Russian-led security grouping, and then, of course, what you might call the Western-inspired groups, such as the OSCE and, of course, NATO. So these divergent groups are each also presenting their own discourse about conflict in the region and their own policy responses to it. To do this, we're looking at the moment, we're looking at three case studies, particularly looking at Osh in southern Kyrgyzstan, which was an outbreak of inter-ethnic violence in 2010, and then at two armed conflicts in Tajikistan, in Horog and in Rasht, again in the last couple of years. These have been relatively small but important, significant armed conflicts which have involved both local responses and these international responses from Russia, China and Western organizations. So we're doing a lot of fieldwork around these, both in terms of local responses to conflict and also talking to our teams in Beijing and Moscow about how these different states have responded to each of these conflicts. And we're trying to answer a range of questions here. I won't go through all of them. We're particularly interested, for example, in the way that authoritarian, semi-authoritarian regimes respond to conflict. Is this a very different approach from democratic and liberal regimes? And does this explain some of this divergence that's going on at both global and regional levels in terms of responses to internal conflict? We're also very interested in the state, again reflecting some of the common themes across several of the projects. And these states in Central Asia traditionally are quite weak, at least on the surface, but are bolstered in various ways by internal and sometimes informal, clientelist and political economic networks that actually maybe are also a different kind of response to internal fracture and internal conflict. Obviously this raises lots of interesting conceptual questions. We feed a lot into the debate about international liberal peace, about liberal peace building, about hybridity in post-conflict situations. And we're very interested in this idea of a particularly sort of post-liberal or non-liberal approach to internal conflict that is emerging both internationally in discussions in UN Security Council, but also in these local responses to local conflicts. So these are some of the sort of broader sort of conceptual and theoretical ideas that we're looking at. We can discuss those perhaps in relation to some of the other projects as well. Just wanted to highlight who's involved. Newcastle next to the two main universities, but we also have this non-governmental organisation, Safer World, on board, which is partly because of their experience of research in some of these countries, but also as a way of trying to produce innovative impact events in Russia and China in particular, but also in London in terms of relating with policy groups in Brussels, London, Washington and elsewhere. Just finally, we also have an international advisory board which we've found useful as a way of bringing people into the project and providing access to policymakers in Moscow and Beijing. And we also have these fieldwork teams on the ground inside Central Asia itself and in Russia and China. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.